and thank you for not skiving off to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which I did yesterday. We're going to talk about the HSS perspective, but before we do, I'd like to introduce the other colleagues who have agreed to participate in the session. And it's Patrick Alexander in the middle, who is the director of the Pennsylvania State University Press and serves on the executive board of the the Association of University Presses. There was a name change recently. He also serves on various publications committees and advisory boards of other university presses, is active in related projects, and also, as I'm sure many of you know, regularly contributes to a number of trade publications. He's helped develop business models for the arts and humanities. That's key. That promote both access and sustainability. Angela Gibson, to my immediate right, is the Director of Scholarly Communications at the Modern Language Association, where she oversees the development of MLA-style resources, book and journal publications, and digital initiatives. She has nearly 2 decades of experience in scholarly publishing and holds a PhD in medieval literature, which means she's familiar with the books that my company publishes. Alex Holzman, at the far end, is the CEO of Alex Publishing Solutions, a consulting firm serving academic presses in various ways, including managing the criminology list for Lynne Rienner, is it Rienner or Rienner? Rienner publishers, and co-editing the Journal of Scholarly Publishing. From 2003 until 2014, he was director at Temple University Press, and during his 40-year career, he also worked at Cambridge, Ohio State University Press, and Charles Scribner's. He served as president of the Association of American University Presses from 2008 to 2009. And I've been with De Gruyter for 18 months now. I was at Springer until just after the merger for 10 years, and before that, a short period at Elsevier. And before that, I was involved in lobbying and communications activities in Brussels for a number of different industries. What we're doing today is not dividing up our time among the 4 speakers and then entertaining questions and trying to tie it all together. We've come up with a number of questions which we've grouped into, let's say, 5 major areas. We're going to start with the meta issues first, and then work our way down into more specific things. And the 5 meta areas are humanities and social sciences as defender of freedom, democracy, and all that is good. The second point is also very meta, and that what does publishing mean? What is it? Then we're going to talk a bit about partnership. We're going to talk about open access. We're going to talk about money. And we're going to talk about being a David, as in David and Goliath, and how that is a good thing, but also a challenging thing. So those are the 5 areas. We will discuss amongst ourselves, and I think then what probably makes more sense to keep everything sort of in its individual silo, which is a good thing in this case. We'll take questions after we finish one of the meta issues. And if people are not in the mood to ask questions from the audience, then we'll move on and we can take more questions at the end. Does that sound like a plan? And we have a grand total of 1 slide to show you later on. So there's nothing to photograph except us. So the first general question we had, and that is HSS as defender of everything that is good, is basically why should STM members care about HSS publishing? And this whole debate at quite high level and permeating just about any society is the division between practical knowledge and knowledge for knowledge's sake, or traditional liberal arts. This is a question originally from Alex, I think, that it's worth remembering that science was long considered a liberal art, and a science department was usually a long part of College of Liberal Arts in research universities. And the final question is, you came to this session. Why? Let me just start. I find it, and we'll talk to this when we talk about money, I find it challenging in a society, whether it's in the US or Europe or China or South America. We talk a lot about technological advancement, about finding cures for cancer, for example, from this morning, about self-driving cars, about all these technological developments which are important for progress in society in a general way. But what I think we as HSS publishers have failed to do, or maybe we need to think about how we could do it better, is to make it clear to society that those technological advancements are important, but if you don't have the philosophers and the political scientists and all of the other humanities and social sciences experts explaining what it means to society, then at some point you won't have a society anymore. And I think that's certainly an interesting point of view that was raised. Go ahead.
I was going to answer it in a similar way by saying that, the first way to answer that question is basically ethical, because you can't afford not to care about us. Today's philosophy student might turn out to be tomorrow's, I don't know, Elon Musk or whatever. But but I think the question is, are there business reasons for you to care about what we're doing? Are there lessons to be learned about how we're doing things in terms of kind of more swiftly moving away from, say, the scientific article into different kind of forms of scholarly production? I don't have the answer to that, but I think that we're talking primarily about ethical reasons to care, and are there things that we can learn from each other that we're doing kind of on the business end that might inform practices?
Since the theme of the conference is breaking down silos, I guess my main point would be that I view humanities, social sciences as in many ways what we use to communicate across the silos while we work within certain silos. And another way of putting this is that in any society that works, there's a kind of shared common knowledge and a shared sense of values. And I don't think we have to look very far to see what happens when that shared sense of things starts to break down. And the only thing that's left is, well, of what use is this to me in doing any particular activity? And I think only the liberal arts can really help us get to that place.
I seem to recall that in ancient Greece, it was a practice to start a speech by flattering the audience. So I think there's something for people in the humanities and social sciences to learn from STM. And hopefully together. I mean, humanities and social sciences compared to STM is like the epitome of a silo. We live in this little orbit where we talk a lot to each other. We don't necessarily talk to a lot of people in STM publishing. And having done this kind of work for 30-something years, I've learned that often STM is playing four-dimensional chess and we're playing checkers. So I think it's important that we start building some communication between these two siloed groups, that humanities can learn from STM, and then STM might actually be surprised about what the concerns are in the humanities and social sciences. I think there's a lot of room for mutual understanding.
Do we have any questions? Comments? There's one.
Hi, I'm Bill DeLuise with Wiley. I wonder what you think about the movement toward multidisciplinarity in research and in research communications, and what impact that might have on HSS publishing. You know, engineering students who are doing social welfare projects in other parts of the world. Do you think that will break down some of the silos that we're seeing right now?
Anyone? I
mean, on a curricular level, we're primarily an educational publisher in some sense. There have been obviously opportunities on campus to kind of reach beyond certain disciplinary confines. And I think as publishers, do we have a responsibility to bring those lessons learned to a broader audience? Yes, probably we do. Are we doing a good enough job of it? I don't know that we are.
I'm a little skeptical about interdisciplinary study, although we do plenty of it and promote it. I think from a market standpoint, what we find is that often these projects are sort of crack dwellers. Nobody on either side of the issue really locks into the topic. I think that a bigger issue that should be of concern to humanists and social scientists is the narrowing down, the focusing down on certain subject areas, because many small societies, many small groups can't afford to play anymore. So that the conversation, the discourse, the scholarly narrative is becoming truncated. And we're excluding voices that have no way to participate because they don't have the resources to participate. And I think that's the greater danger. Interdisciplinary tries to bridge some gaps, and I think there are some great books out there that reflect that. I like to think we publish some of them, but I think it's tough sledding, and for careers, who's going to judge those interdisciplinary works and get the same kind of reward and recognition in different areas? It's tough. I think it's a tough trick.
I think there's some areas that lend themselves to interdisciplinary approaches. We have a project that involves surgeons and medical professions and ethics, for example. So it's a cooperation between our clinical medicine publishing unit and our philosophy unit, and with some influence of the theologians as well. And that's often, it sounds really dull and dry, but the discussions are often quite interesting and very robust. So I think there's scope. I agree with Patrick that it's hard. You have to assign someone who's in charge without insulting the other partners to move it forward. Sometimes you're right, it does tend to fall between the cracks unless you have people or groups or individuals who are pushing it forward and can open their minds broadly enough that they don't remain experts in their own narrow area of expertise. Anyone else?
Sorry if thanks. I'm Tara Newby. I'm from Sage Publications, and thank you so much for speaking with us today. I had a quick question on basically, how do you see HSS perhaps advising STM on how to make sure that STM research contributes policy or positively to real-world change, perhaps through influencing policy? From what I've seen historically, HSS research has been quite good at communicating with policymakers and making real-world changes. And sometimes in STM, we tend to just speak to our own work and make perhaps certain advances in research and science without contributing significantly to individual lives.
I think the scholars we work with at the MLA would be happy to hear that you think we're doing a good job at doing that, because that's the constant anxiety, is that we're not speaking beyond the confines of, our colleagues. And I know that among the MLA membership, there's been a real effort to retrain scholars to write op-eds, for example, effectively, and find channels beyond what scholarly publishers, frankly, provide them, and that having that type of impact is sought. So that's.
I think one very simplistic reason might be that policymakers probably have an easier time of understanding humanities and social sciences content than they do clinical oncology, for example. So I think that's a benefit. I now work for a publishing company where I actually have some grasp of what's in the books, as opposed to a very general idea that this involves scalpels and cutting and blood or astrophysics, which I'm too limited to understand. I think that might play a role. It's probably not a very intellectual answer, but I imagine most of our policymakers are probably at my level and not at the level of Stephen Hawking and his colleagues.
I guess I have a somewhat differing view in that I think policymakers, if we're talking about legislators and maybe some people in civil services, the fact that they don't understand the science creates a kind of aura and mystique, if I can quote an old New York Yankees slogan. But the idea of curing breast cancer is so attractive that it gets funded. The idea of coming up with an ethical way of running a criminal justice system, as opposed to just saying those people are bad, put them away, is not so attractive, especially when you realize that the first impulse of any politician is to be reelected in the next election. So I'm not sure that serves, but to get to the point of how liberal arts can help STM, I do think it comes back to some of those core values of a society and emphasizing where things fit in and why funding, which when we get to our one slide you'll see rather dramatically, when it's tilted in the way that it's tilted now, leads to some societal problems.
There's another question?
Hi, Angela Cochran from the American Society of Civil Engineers. So we do have a lot of, well, maybe not a lot. We do have overlap with civil engineering, of course, with social sciences in particular. Two of our journals attract both audiences, which is a challenge, of course. But it seems to me like we're sort of at this point in civilization, can I say that? That's very broad, where we need to see a closer connection between what's happening in the science world and what happens in what humanities are doing and social sciences are doing. This sort of, every time you read an article about autonomous vehicles or Facebook and what's going on with data, or how people react to Twitter or Instagram. I mean, it just smacks of technological advancement with zero regard for what is already known in the social sciences. And even, looking at some of the projects that my members and my authors are looking at, how to create cities that are moving with autonomous vehicles is very important, and there are huge social implications to all of that. So how do we get to a point where we do merge this in a research and a publication way without the barriers of, well, I'm a social scientist, and if I work on engineering stuff, they won't know how to judge an engineering journal, or, I hear things about the social science journals handle things differently than the engineering journals do, and therefore the social scientists, they don't fit well, or they won't publish with the American Society of Civil Engineers because that's not where their peers are, and so they think that it won't be read. But these are really important. This whole, technological advancement has a huge social science component, and how do we get those things together? How do we break down those barriers so that there isn't a barrier for publishing research together?
In my experience, that problem really starts with the researchers and the academics themselves and within their departments, or silos if we want to call them that at this point, because they want to get tenure and they want to get promoted, and it's very hard until you have tenure and you've reached a certain level where you're comfortable doing whatever seems attractive, is pretty much discouraged if it's not going to get you the points that you need to get you a more or less permanent job. I suppose if I feel very optimistic, the fact that the tenure system is beginning to break down, or at least that's my belief, when you look at the number of non-tenured faculty on any given research university campus now versus tenured faculty or even tenured track faculty, maybe one of the good things will be that people can work together. But until there's some kind of reward, and I don't know, and it'd be really interesting to hear what people on both sides of this feel that as publishers we can do to help the departments and the scholars break down those silos of their own. But I think that problem rests largely in the university structure much more than it does with us.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, I think that needs to be addressed on the level of education curriculum, and also I don't see it getting better anytime soon because education's increasingly become, job training essentially. So, I mean, I think it's a real question. What can publishers do after the fact, after the training has taken place, after an education has occurred in a certain way to break that down?
It seems to me that one of the big issues for both the STM community and for the humanities and social science communities are sort of being able to reestablish our mutual credibility. And until we can, what used to be called the democratization of information via the internet has actually become informational anarchy. Right? Anybody can say anything. And those of us in this room who respect science and who respect the work of humanists and social scientists scratch our head when people wonder about climate change. And why can't we get the message out that this is the best stab at what is right and true, and why don't we have the authority to do this? I think this is a policy question that all of us need to be thinking about, and how do we influence the people in Washington and elsewhere to pay attention to voices that have actually done the work, who've actually done the research to establish what is verifiable and valid as far as we know now. And I think that's a really huge challenge for all of us in this room. And especially the social sciences and humanities struggle a little bit more, I think, in that for many of the disciplines, they're continuing to plow the same ground, right? Unless Shakespeare writes another sonnet, what are you going to write about Shakespeare? And I think that's a real dilemma for humanists when there's no new information. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
Can I say one more? Patrick just put me in mind of when he was talking about the difficulty of reading some of what we do. Well, maybe as publishers, we need to be thinking a little bit more about rewarding by publishing articles that are not necessarily entirely research-oriented, but speak to a more general audience and provide some general education. I know that's really difficult. It's difficult for the faculty themselves because they might not get the same credit. But I know that, for instance, the American Political Science Association launched a journal, Perspectives on Politics, somewhere in the early 2000s. That was designed to at least address people who were not political scientists, but who were interested in political issues. The journal still exists. It is different from the American Political Science Review, which is a very much more technical and much more esoteric journal, but for people in political science, probably more central. So I wonder whether there are ways to help people understand that, public health is not just a science. Public health is very much a general public issue. Things like that. So maybe there's kind of one thing we could think about.
I do see that happening on the individual level. For example, I know the editor of our flagship journal makes sure that her columns are used to talk about a technology project and infrastructure and sort of things that go beyond the confines of a literary journal, perhaps. But I think it would be worth thinking about larger initiatives that might make that happen more broadly.
Don Samuelak from Editage. One of the speakers had just really triggered my mind. In an era of fake news or labels of such, we struggle with understanding denierism, if that's the proper word. how truth deniers come to be. And on the science side of things, I don't know if anybody else was at the AAAS meeting a few months ago or a couple months ago, but there's huge emphasis on science deniers and the analysis of science deniers from a political perspective, from a science perspective, from humanities perspective, from a social science perspective. My comment is this would be an opportunity for the science journals, the humanities journals, really to come together with special issues about science denial that is absolutely relevant to climate change and other pure science things. And I think it's a real opportunity and a window in time where STM and HSS can really come together to solve or at least bring to light some social issues that need seriously to be addressed.
I think if I could add one thing first to sort of again, you were touching on sort of interdisciplinary. If you look at urban studies, we have a project, or architecture, or how cities are built and how they function. I think on a professional level, so if you have the academics and then you have the professional level, I think their cooperation on interdisciplinary things works better, because by that time you have concrete things to solve or figure out. So in architecture, in energy use in cities, in efficient transport, those types of things, I think you'll see more in that area. And to your question about fake news, science deniers, I like that term, science deniers. I'm going to use that. I think, again, as a small HSS publisher with very important university press partners, last year we opened up a bunch of journals and books on a variety of subjects: gender, human rights, immigration, those types of things. And we opened it up for free, targeting journalists to help them find out facts and get access to literature. But then opened it to the wider public, and we're probably going to continue to do that in one form or another, because it was a huge success. Everyone was happy with usage. Not a lot of money was created by that particular activity, but certainly awareness and usage increased, and that's always something that I think most HSS publishers would welcome. So I think you're right. The role that not just HSS publishers, but also the large STM publishers, to combat with partners, whether it's the World Conference of Science Journalists or the AAAS meetings or whatever it is. I think that's very, very important and becoming more important, and not just in the US. So I think that's something for all of us to think about. What role can we play in preventing fake news or helping to correct it afterwards, whether it's climate change, whether it's women's rights, women's issues, women's health issues, or whatever. I think that's a key role. Of course, not uncontroversial. So, but I think that's a very good point. We've been drifting towards talking about breaking silos and cooperation. So maybe we'll move on to the next, if that's okay with the rest of the panel, to talk a bit about how do you cooperate? What is the cooperation that's going on now? We all know that larger publishers also offer society publishing. Smaller publishers like us do as well, not only to societies, but to university presses, to nonprofit presses as well. And without getting into the, nonprofit is better than commercial, because, whether you call it a profit or a surplus, the benefit is still to a relatively reduced number of beneficiaries. How is that going to look in the future? Are partnerships between those in the room amongst each other going to be more on a commercial distribution platform technology level? Or are we going to have more cooperation on content, editorial, putting together? For example, Asian studies is something that we're very focused on, and we work with a bunch of partners who continue their programs, and we just tie it all together, and it's marketed jointly, an Asian studies package with University of Hawaii, de Gruyter content, other university presses. Is it going to be more about the content, or is it going to be more about how content gets delivered and used?
used.
I guess I'll start, my way into this question is I think about MLA members, and there's so many other organizations they could belong to, and we know that scholars in the humanities can't afford to belong to every professional association they want to, so they have to pick and choose. That's not good for them, that's not good for the other organizations, that's not good for the MLA. So I think some cooperative arrangements need to be found to help pool resources, to help scholars have access to all the resources that they want, so that the most effective organization can be identified to provide a given resource. I was initially thinking that there has to continue to be autonomy on the level of and editorial independence on the level of content, but this hearing the different ways that it might be useful to reach beyond, say, a language and literature organization makes me think that some sort of cooperative arrangements might be fruitful, even on the editorial level. I think the other thing I would say, well, I'll stop there. Yeah.
I think in HSS publishing and cooperation, I'm speaking maybe more about university presses per se, it's often very practically difficult to work with other institutions because one state does things one way, another state does it another way. I'm currently negotiating a book series contract with a large university in the Northeast, and the attorneys have already gnawed through more paperwork trying to make a decision about, a book that's going to sell 120 copies. And just to cooperate is just such a struggle. So it's really, there are practical impediments to creating cooperative models in at least in my experience in the university press community. It happens, and it happens pretty well with some examples not too far away, Project Muse out of Johns Hopkins University, some other things that are going on, but it's not easy.
Yeah, I would just add to that. It's not easy, but it is happening, and it happens in some fairly interesting kinds of ways, and which is, and I don't mean to jump ahead, but it does come back to what will define, at least in humanities and social sciences, being a publisher in the years to come. Because there is this movement to combine efforts on certainly distribution for years. Very few presses, very few university presses, and again, because of my own background, that's mostly what I can speak to, would distribute their own products, at least their own physical products, and not their own electronic products either. They're finding other places like Muse or like JSTOR or other places. That's old. Now production is beginning to be farmed out to certain places. And there are initiatives within the university press world at North Carolina, and there are a lot of services that will just do this for you. All of this, of course, being driven by the fact that university presses are extremely cash-strapped right now, as we say. And another interesting partnership, and I don't know where this is going to go. I know Patrick now and myself, for half the time that I ran a university press, reported directly into university librarians. At different places, that can mean very different things. It can simply mean an administrative reporting line and not much else. But in other places, it's leading to partnerships, and especially as libraries are getting more and more interested in doing what they call publishing, and again, I'm not sure how we define that, themselves, in order particularly to provide textbook materials, OER kinds of materials to students, and calling on some of the expertise of university presses. Where I don't see much of this happening is because university presses are almost exclusively, with some exceptions, some notable exceptions, humanities, social science oriented. I don't see the kind of collaborations with the STM community, perhaps with the exception of some kinds of platforms for a university press that has some journals that would lend themselves to places like Highwire or something like that, or partnerships with other places for distributing electronic products. That would be interesting, and I'm not sure how it would work, and I'm not sure how practical it would be, but certainly within the university press world, publishing, because of the pressure of shortfall of surplus or whatever you want to call it, and the overall shortfall of budgets within universities, is having to do this kind of cooperating or die, which is not hyperbole. Another university press announced its closing last week, so there we are.
About the audience, any thoughts?
I have a question for the panel, Darrell Gunter, STM. As you're looking to break down silos, and recently I had the opportunity of meeting with Patrick at the beautiful campus of Penn State, and we talked about the library and how the libraries are establishing their own publishing platforms outside of the university presses. I've often scratched my head when I heard a presentation from Rush Miller back at an AAUP meeting, now it's called AUP, a few years ago. Why are those silos being developed within the university, where you want to break down silos, but by having the libraries have their own publishing platforms or programs separate from the university presses, why does that occur?
I think that's a great question, Darrell. You should ask them. Yeah, it's a mystery. I tend to, I report to the Dean of Libraries at Penn State. We have a good working relationship. It is basically a budget conversation. I think that those relationships are often based on personalities, and they are, but from the standpoint of culturally, financially, and mission, they're almost inverted. Libraries are service organizations. We're not. We say no more than we say yes. Our finances are, we have to make money to stay alive. We don't get much of an allocation. Libraries, their allocation's about 100% of their budget, not always. And then culturally, libraries face inward. They're campus facing. They're totally focused on students and campus and faculty. And most of our clients and partners are outside the university. So I for one, don't think it's a great, I think it's great because we get cover, we get political clout from the libraries, but I think once you start moving toward an integration, the cultural forces tend to bend in favor of the libraries because they have the money, and then you wind up being a service organization and not publishing. If I can keep yammering, one of the things, we're talking about Society Day and silos. One of the real problems that I see and others besides me see in HSS publishing are very tiny societies that have something significant to contribute to conversations, and yet they're so small, they're rarely of interest to a commercial publisher. By the way, the Latin motto of Penn State University Press, I can't remember the Latin, but the English is the poor helping the poor. And so we go out to these small societies and try to work with them. These are, members under 1,000, under 200 sometimes. And working with some people from Wayne State and from IUPUI and Ursinus, and along with Helen Sketty, we're working on trying to create a model for these small societies to actually come together and find some services in a financial way that makes it work for them. Otherwise, they're just going to die on the vine. They're just not going to make it. And arguably, these could be important marginal voices that need to be heard. And that, again, what concerns me is the discourse continues to shrink. The voices, even though we say we're global, we continue to have that Western European, North American axis of conversation, and we're not. I think, again, STM's ahead of us in going into Asia, South Asia, but humanities and social sciences are struggling to really have an impact.
I think that goes back also to, I think there's a vision of a society as being a complete ecosystem unto itself. And, I guess societies have a convening function, right? They organize a convention maybe, or they publish a journal. are you a society if you have members, if you have a staff? So I think that the types of societies you're talking about might have to give up the vision of being that complete ecosystem and work on a cooperative model with other larger societies to sustain themselves. I don't know what that looks like. I imagine some shared services arrangements, but
If I may, I grew up in a grocery store in Atlantic City. We had a store, and there was a corner store down the street from us and a corner store down the street and over from us. It was 3 of us in this neighborhood. And whenever we would run short on an item, each store would supply the other store with what they needed. And that partnership worked for a number of years. Patrick, to your suggestion, it seems to be a solution that will allow the societies to foster and grow, because everyone doesn't need to have a different membership database or CRM or whatever it might be. Have there been any talks or discussions among societies to say, hey, let's really look at this strategically and let's put some firm steps in place to achieve this?
Well, we're in the second phase of this grant, and the next phase would be actually to construct a business model that would hopefully find some funding from universities. Universities have historically funded publishing in the HSS field by offering a course release or some office space or maybe even some staff support. That money's drying up. I mean, the universities are spending $20,000, $30,000 a year easily. So the idea of this potential business model is to say, okay, universities, what if you get in for just a few $1,000s and you get 200 or 300 universities to contribute $2,000, then you could have a small staff. And this staff could then offer services for which these organizations would pay some fee, but it would be, in a sense, something that would not be the total financial burden upon them. And of course, everybody wants their hand in Mellon's pocket too for a little bit of this. But I think these societies need to cooperate. They need to find these services without having to pay an arm and a leg, and they need to professionalize. I mean, some of them that exist have no bylaws. So how do you enter into agreements with other entities without having bylaws as a business? I'm not sure. But those are the kinds of issues that we're running up against, but I think we're finding a lot of receptivity from these small societies because they know they're in trouble. They know that, especially if they have a journal and it's in print, and only print. So anyway, go out.
I just wanted very quickly to get back to your original question, and libraries creating their own platforms and stuff like that. Well, in certain places they are talking to university presses about doing it, but I guess in a perverse kind of way, I'm glad that they are undertaking some of this themselves because it will introduce them to the concept of cost. And they do have the bias that Patrick talked about of they want to provide service and they want to provide things for free, which sort of gets us into open access, and which has become, as we were talking before the session, more of a religion than a business model in the minds of some people, when actually, in reality, it would seem to be more a business model than a religion. But the more that you can get the librarians into seeing that it costs X amount to create a platform, or it costs Y amount just to take a small journal from a very small society like Patrick's talking about, and some of them are, in fact, turning to libraries to publish their journals electronically, that there's cost involved, even if it's just staff time. That means that staff can't do something else. So on my optimistic days, I have hopes that as they discover real costs, they'll discover that generating a revenue stream is not a terrible thing.
Okay.
So this is Bert Corelli with TrendMD. I'm curious what your perspectives are on quantitative measures of impact. On the STM side, there's a lot of preoccupation with impact factor, and probably too much so. And the scale can be pretty broad from the high impact mega journals that have high factors and all the way down the line. And on the social science and humanities journals, I mean, the scale would obviously be much lower. But I mean, how important is impact in a quantitative way? I mean, whether it's measured by impact factor or alt metrics or whatever.
Patrick, do you want to have a go?
I think that, as is often the case, HSS tends to emulate what it sees in STM. I remember Isaiah Berlin's famous essay on the divorce between the humanities and the sciences, and it's been that story for a long, long time. Humanists are just starting to catch up and say, hey, wait, what's my impact factor? And now we don't have much of a way to measure it other than downloads. That's probably the best tool that we have is digital downloads and records that we get from JSTOR and Muse. But in the sciences, in the social sciences and humanities, often works aren't relevant for 3 or 4 years, and then they start having an impact. They start generating interest, and then nobody's really measuring that kind of stuff. I tend to be skeptical of impact in the, I mean, when you're selling 150 copies of a book, your impact's not going to be very great. I'm just stating the obvious.
There's also an interesting grant. I'm not going to try to go into the ins and outs of it, being run right now by Rebecca Kinnison out of Columbia called Humetrics. It's a, metrics for the humanities, humane form of metrics, and just that's something interesting to look into if you want to think about it further.
Okay, we've touched on a few times now on money, lack of, or excess of, or desire for. So we're going to move into that direction. Under money, we should also discuss open access, because open access does have a cost. It's not a panacea. I certainly don't think it's a movement. I know some of my colleagues would disagree. And this is where you get to see our only slide. So if the nice gentleman in the back would show us the pie chart. Do you want to explain this, Patrick, since I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but
This actually
the
represents
bits you might not want.
the 2017 budget allocation request from the National Science Foundation, from the National Institutes of Health, compared to the two leading granting agencies, the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And
That's a
we
little
didn't
bit
show
at
it
the
on a
top.
bar graph because you can't see those on a bar graph.
And we were so happy it came through even. We were happy
So
for that.
the ratio is there is, in case you're trying to do the math, is about $37 billion in the NSF and NIH compared to 300,000? 300 million. So this kind of gives you an idea of the lack of funding in the arts and science and the arts and humanities. And this doesn't count Department of Defense money either, I might just throw out there. And humanists don't begrudge the sciences anything. Give them more money, but give us a little bit too, So that's a fundamental problem and a fundamental difference between HSS publishing and funding for publishing and STM. And by the way, neither one of these agencies, up until recently, ever funded publishing at all. They avoided funding publishing. Well, that shut them down.
Yeah, I think once you see it up there, I tend to be an optimist, so I think, my goodness, with such little money, so much scholarship. But my goodness, wouldn't it be nice if we could get at least a bit more to do even more? That might have an influence on how humanities influence society. It's sort of the first question we discussed. How important is it for the humanities and social sciences to explain what the heck is going on in society as a whole? And as probably most of you are based in the US, the debates about funding for the NEA and the Endowment for the Humanities, I mean, the discussions and the fights about those budget lines are disproportionate to the fighting that goes on for the other bits. I mean, there's a lot more fighting because, again, you're touching social issues. You're touching a bunch of issues that border on the religious or on the philosophical. But we thought you should see this, especially since many of you are STM publishers, that we're not doing too bad considering how poor we are. Any thoughts?
I have a question for the audience, and then I'll turn it over to Angela. By a show of hands, how many of you feel that the humanities and social sciences are important to the civilization of mankind? Please raise your hand. Okay, now leave your hand up. Leave your hand up. How many of you have actually contacted your congressman or your senator about the humanities? Okay. How many of you have actually attended a march for humanities and social sciences? Okay, that's our challenge. That's our opportunity.
I guess I'm sort of going to say the same thing. So the Science Foundation and the Institutes of Health get funded because there's a perceived notion that the funder is getting something for that society is getting something for that. And we can all say, and I would also guess that a lot of us have degrees in a liberal arts major. I mean, we work in publishing, it's not out of the blue. That there needs to be an effort to communicate from the social sciences, from the HSS side, why that's important. Like, we can sit here and say, yes, of course it's important, we think it's important, but that message is clearly not making it to the funders and the policymakers. And I don't know how that happens because that's not what my job is, but you know, it seems like if there's an opportunity to influence, let's say, the National Science Foundation so that they understand that this project that they're funding has a social science aspect to it or component to it, that it's going to require those research groups to actually work together and put in a grant proposal for it, not to wait for somebody to, you know, come up with the money, or not to say, well, we'll do our part of it, and oh, we can't because we don't have the funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Like, if there's, it goes back to the silo busting, and if the research institutions that are supporting HSS want to get a bigger piece of that pie, then they're going to have to go after it in a way that gets a piece of that pie.
We have another question up here.
Hi, this is Roger Schoenfeld from Ithaca SNR. Really interesting to hear the coverage of humanities and social sciences here today. I guess to me this graph, which has caught all of our attention, is, you know, it's indicative of the same problems that we have on campuses for the humanities, that libraries, for example, have on campus for the humanities, which is that we don't have as much of a societal emphasis on these topics or societal valuing of these topics as we in this room might think we should do. And yet at the same time, I can't help but reflect on the fact that the business models that so many of the publishers who are represented here in the audience in this room pursue have I think an unintended side effect, that they're squeezing out of academic library budgets the funding for humanities and non-journal formats. And so I guess I want to ask a little bit more pointedly than I've heard in the discussion thus far. I don't want to turn this into something antagonistic, but rather constructive, which is, what could an STM publisher constructively do to, because this is also increasingly what an academic library budget is starting to look like, right? More and more and more of it goes to the sciences, less and less of it goes to the humanities and social sciences. And so I guess I'm wondering, what could an STM publisher, in a way that benefited its bottom line, right? Because this is a business question, not an ethical or moral or political question. What could an STM publisher do that would benefit its bottom line, that would contribute to strengthening humanities and social sciences publishing? I'm frankly not sure I know what that is, but I would really like to hear a little more focus on maybe that kind of a question here today.
I don't think, if I can, I don't think humanities publishers, certainly not us and probably none of them in this room, are looking to STM to solve that problem, to STM publishers to solve that problem. I really doubt very much whether humanities publishers would look to the large 3 STM publishers to help solve that problem. I think it's more of a question, and we touched on it earlier, about humanities publishers, even though the market is fragmented. There are lots of small humanities publishers. If you look at publishers overall, the big ones at the top are all focused on hard science, if you will. They might have humanities, but the main focus, also the main financial focus, the main income is from the hard sciences. And all the fragmented small ones are going to be much more heavily humanities. I think it's a question of how humanities publishers cooperate or band together in whatever way or form, how they get loud and write to the funders, not just public funders, but also private funders, to raise this question. And I think if I have one criticism, is that that has not happened because of the number of sort of the not quite trusting and holding on to your, the silos that we've all built up out of self-protection, which may have worked in the past, but obviously isn't going to work if this sort of thing goes on. I think the solution for any humanities publisher is to provide excellent content, increase that content, and make sure that people can access it in using whatever business model you have. But I don't think, aside from looking at what STM publishers are doing and how they do it, I don't think there's going to be any help in the sense that they're going to help solve the problem that we as humanities publishers have. But there's another question in the back, Darrell? Or, oh, Helen, sorry. Did you, yeah.
I was just going to opine. I think that humanities publishers and to some extent social science publishers, researchers suffer from an image problem. And the society perceives this, the kind of over-specialization that takes place as being useless. And in some instances, maybe it is. I think many publishers are trying, one of the things that we're trying to do, and I think every other university press is trying to do books that do reach a wider audience and yet are informed by scholarly research practices and have that kind of integrity and the peer review process that stands behind it. But I remember in a workshop one time, I was with a colleague and we were trying to get people to think about projects, and we gave them a sample abstract of a project, and it was on the history of the button and the collapse of French morals in 14th century Paris. And people believed that was true. I mean, they thought it was a real project. And that says something about what the humanities have the potential to do when they start going down this ever-increasing narrow focus on material. So I think we want to see publishers need to start trying to find a way to break away from that, and I think they're starting to do it, and that might help a little bit.
I don't have an answer to your question. I don't think any of us, do exactly. But my instinct is that if STM publishers are going to essentially get anything out of humanities publishers that affects their bottom line, that activity is going to be centered on education, early educational initiatives, collaborative ones.
Yeah, I just a small thing to add. I think, sadly, again, what's reflected in what Roger pointed out and in this chart are the values of the society. At the same time, you see that kind of funding. It's also true, yes, libraries are spending more and more of their budget on STM materials, but it's also true that the library budgets, as a percentage of university budgets, are shrinking simultaneously. It's also true that state aid to state universities is shrinking. I heard a report on NPR this morning that an increasing number of state universities in this country depend more on tuition dollars now than they do on state aid, which is a reversal of historic trends. And because it was on a Philadelphia station, they pointed out that in the state of Pennsylvania, 72% of the operating dollars that universities use now comes from tuition as opposed to coming from state aid. So to sort of grope microscopically toward Roger's question of how STM publishers and humanities social sciences publishers could work together would be, somehow to create an awareness of the fact that practical, immediately applicable knowledge is not always the right goal for funding any kind of activity, and also that just knowledge and critical thinking, I guess a particular emphasis on critical thinking these days, is something that is worth investing in. And these are problems that are much bigger than any of us in the room, but we all have to start someplace. So.
Okay. I just joke. I guess maybe STM should become the double STM. Double means social science and social science. So yes, my meaning is STM maybe can establish the subcommittee for the social science. Actually, no. The global is the same. I heard you conventions. Actually, in China, it's same as these numbers. Usually, social science, scientists and research, the lesson, the foundations. But natural science get much more foundations. This is true. Global is same. As I mentioned this morning, in our country, we launched the PRIJ just for the STM. It's not for the social science. And this is maybe only one of the reasons. Actually, other reason, maybe we have few social science journal. It's not like your Western countries. And, but I remember my daughter said, if I was the native, she graduated from Harvard, she told me, Mom, if I was the native, absolutely I want to learn social science, humanity, because there are many questions and problems should be interesting to research. Even, engineering, also the engineering maybe have psychology or some problem. So I think in the future, maybe social science and the natural science should combine together. Maybe some cross-refer, multiply journal will be launched. But my question is, you should pay much more attention for the developing countries. Actually, in the developing countries, few social science journal. That's maybe, history, for example, China, long history, and India, long history. So that's maybe interesting. So this is my one suggestion. My question is, we know social science lays the foundations from government, from some, funding agents. But for you, how do you earn money? Because you are press, you are published, you are, if you open the, or if you carry the OA model, maybe you can earn money because research no money pay OA fees. But how do you publish to earn money? My interesting one. Now this is the first question. Yeah, just who pays the contents? Who pays the values?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Can I go ahead and have a stab at that? I think the last question in terms of how do you earn money with humanities and social science, the answer is it's not that difficult. If you provide high quality content that people want, even the very specific, kind of very detailed, what you were describing with buttons in 14th century France, I'm sure we probably have a book on that. I'm absolutely positive we have something that detailed. and this is perhaps the difference between a commercial publisher and a society publisher or a not-for-profit publisher. Before we decide to do a book, we do analysis on what we think, how it will do financially. Not always. Sometimes there are loss leaders. We realize, okay, we want to do this book because it's important. It probably will not make money, but we know that we have these other 5 books in that general area that are doing well, and so we can afford to do this. So the business models are different. In terms of open access, there it gets a bit more tricky, and there's also a big geographic difference, how open access for the humanities works in the US or in Germany or in the UK or in China, if and when it happens, is going to be very different. And there, in Germany at least, which is the market I know best, there is a lot of interest in open access for the humanities, but there's also money. And so we're beyond this, everything should be free for the greater good of mankind, which is not untrue, if possible, but what also is not untrue is there is no such thing as free. Somebody has to pay for it. And this is the main funders in Germany for social science. They've realized that now. You can always argue of, is $2,000 too much for an article or not? Is $5,000 or euros too much for a book, an open access book or not? Should it be more? Should it be less? You can argue about that, but the first big step in Germany was to make funders understand nothing is for free. Publishing costs money. There is added value that publishers provide. And as soon as you recognize that, we can haggle about the other things. That's okay. And if you say no more than 500 euro per article, there will be publishers that will develop a business model, or technology companies maybe, that make it happen. So open access, yes, it's not free. You have to find the money. Finding the money is not easy. It's also not what publishers were originally created to do, but it's not impossible. So I think,
One more question.
oh, I'm sorry.
So David Sampson from American Society of Clinical Oncology, and I have a question, and this comes from knowing very little to next to nothing about HSS publishing, but how would you assess the level of innovation within HSS publishing from a content perspective, not necessarily content publishing, but whether it be other types of content for different audiences beyond your core audience? Is the funding there, is the capital there to innovate, or are you really handcuffed?
I think the thing that I see the desire for innovation. We have innovative and collaborative publication platforms that we've been working on at the MLA. The thing I see affecting the scholars that publish with us the most is the tenure requirements are still quite conservative, so that even if we have this amazing kind of technological project that they can do innovative, interesting, different things with short-form content, rearranging it, et cetera, some of them can't do that and still have a worthy tenure case. So we have to work as an organization, as we do, with institutions in kind of helping to rethink their tenure requirements. So that's the problem we see and that I recently come up against.
It seems also the case that the kinds of publishing, the scale of the publishing that takes place in humanities is often so small that a project is not replicable. It's not worth finding another way to do it. There's not enough, everything turns out to be boutique, and that's a real problem. People talk about having ancillary materials, whether it's sound files or videos or still photography, and we're able to do that, but it doesn't really generate revenue often. It's just an additional cost, and I think we've been pretty far behind in terms of being really innovative because everything seems like a one-off.
But I do think there's been some innovation. A lot of it is getting funded. I sometimes think in a slightly dangerous way, in that the Andrew Mellon Foundation tends to fund almost all of the experiments that go on in university press publishing, and if they ever decide they're not interested anymore, I'm not quite sure what will happen. But there are, the University of Minnesota just introduced its platform called Manifold, I believe, and Michigan is working on one called Fulcrum that will allow for these kinds of things, and then also for the whole question of maintaining them over time. How do you archive something that's multimedia when the multimedia platforms change over time, which is an issue that all of you probably have more experience with than most HSS publishers. So the will is there, the money's not, and I completely agree that the younger scholars who are the most likely to undertake this are also the ones who are most vulnerable, and they have to be very careful about what they undertake.
I think I've been waiting to say this for the past hour, so I'm glad that it kind of fits in neatly with what we've been discussing, and we are, after all, in Philadelphia, and so I'm going to paraphrase Benjamin Franklin as a motivational bit of information for you to take away, and that is, as the Americans in the room will know, he said, surely we must hang together, or absolutely we will hang separately. So this is an appeal to large, small, commercial, non-commercial, society, publishers, university presses, to think about how there could be more collaboration without giving up your independence, which is important. Everybody recognizes that, even an independent commercial publisher like us. How we can work together, and I'm not going to say outside of the box because I can't hear that cliche anymore. But think about creative ways to work with people you may have never considered working with in the past. So if you're a publisher, think about working with a small society that has very little budget, but a lot to say. And if you're a small society, don't be afraid of all commercial publishers. There might be one or two you might want to be afraid of, but all commercial publishers are not the same, just like all societies are not the same. So with that, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.